Lister crunched his way through 5 gear changes, and Blue Midget lurched like a drunken linebacker over the airless black desert of the unnamed moon. Helium winds whipped the sand into huge tapering swirls that twisted across the dry, featureless landscape like a pack of children's spinning tops. Lister landed the mining juggernaut with all the natural grace of a suicidal elephant tumbling from the Eiffel Tower.
"Nice landing, buddy,"
said the cat, digging his way out of the pile of storage lockers which had collapsed on him. Lister threw the cat a spacesuit. "Put this on." The cat looked at the battered old dirty silver regulation issue spacesuit with disdain.
"Are you kidding? I wouldn't use this to buff my shoes."
Lister clambered into his own. "Put it on."
"Are you seriously telling me these shoulders were ever in style?"
"Put it on." The cat held the suit at arm's length.
"Well, maybe if I widen the lapels, put in a couple of vents, maybe some sequins down the legs."
"We're going mining," said Lister. "We're not in the heats of cum jiving. We're going to work."
"Hey, I do not do the W word."
"We're all doing the W word," said Lister. Crichton stepped through the hatchway from Blue Midget's galley, carrying a tray of tea things and a plate of petit fours. "I thought we might have some tea," he said, setting the cups in the saucers. "We're going smeggin' mining." Lister threw his spacesuit gauntlet against the wall. "Milk or lemon?" Crichton smiled. "You're in charge of processing. I can't do this all on my own."
"I'll have milk,"
said the cat. "Is nobody listening? We're going uranium mining. It's a helium atmosphere out there. It's going to be hard and it's going to be dangerous." "All the more reason," said Crichton, "to have a nice hot cup of tea inside you." Lister inflated his cheeks and expelled the air. He hunched over the orange and green flashing display of the trace computer, which beeped and blipped with annoying regularity as it processed soil samples in search of the main seam. "Holly, have we found the main deposit yet?" "No," said Holly. "I'd give it another 25 glimbarts." "What's a glimbart?" "It's 50 nanotechs." "You're just making this up, aren't you?" "No," Holly protested feebly. "Where is it, then?" "I dunno," he confessed. "I thought you were supposed to have an IQ of 6,000. 6,000's not that much," said Holly, aggrieved. "It's only the same IQ as 12,000 PE teachers."
"Hey,"
said the cat, waving the cake tray.
"Are there any more of these little pink ones?"
"Coming right up," said Crichton. Lister banged his head gently against the screen of the trace computer and wished, not for the first time, that a different sperm had fertilized his mother's egg. It was 10:30 a.m., and Rimmer had already been up for 6 hours. He was standing on the deck of the cargo bay, calling out pointless orders to a group of scutters who were operating the cantilever crane, which was gently hoisting the Nova 5's rear section up into the air.
"Up a bit! Up! Up! More!"
The crane gingerly swung the huge tail section so it was suspended high above the ship's front half.
"Round! Round! Swing it round!"
Rimmer was calling redundantly.
"Swing it round, just like you are doing."
This was the 3rd day of the grueling new regime the two Rimmers had instigated for themselves. The timetable went thus: rise at 4:30, exercises till 5, repair supervision followed by lunch at 9:30 a.m., planning meeting at 10, supervision duties until supper at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, more supervision until second supper at 5 p.m., technical reading till 6, then it was repair supervision all the way until supper 3 at 9, then rest and recreation up to midnight, followed by supper 4 and planning meeting until bed at 2. For some reason, the new regime meant having 6 hologrammatic meals a day, and only 2.5 hours sleep. Rimmer was near to cracking. His patience threshold was practically non-existent, but he certainly wasn't going to be the one who said, "Let's ease off." That would be weak and spineless, the old Arnold J. Rimmer, not the new, high-powered winner. Let his duplicate be the one to wimp out. The huge chains moaned and creaked as the scutters began to lower the tail into place against the front section. Rimmer rubbed the grey rings around his eyes, thought how tired his copy must be feeling at this moment, and suddenly got a new burst of energy.
Down!
He shouted unnecessarily.
Down! Lower! Big man!
Rimmer's duplicate bounded down the gantry stairwell onto the cargo deck. Rimmer was aghast to see how fresh-faced and alert his copy appeared. Had he been cheating? Had he been secretly snoozing instead of supervising the supply inventory? It was perfectly possible. He'd been away 3 hours, and quite frankly he certainly looked a heck of a lot better than he should have done. But surely he wouldn't cheat him. That would be like cheating himself. That would be like cheating at patience. Wait a minute, Rimmer remembered. I do cheat at patience.
Big man, the double repeated. You're doing it wrong. You should be moving the front section around to the rear section rather than swinging the rear section around to meet the front section. What the smeg difference does it make?
Rimmer snapped.
Because if you weld them together in that position, the ship will have to take off in reverse.
Rimmer looked round. The double was right. The ship was pointing in the wrong direction. How could he have made such a monumentally stupid error? It must be because he was tired. Then, how come his duplicate spotted it? Surely he was just as tired, unless... He had been cheating.
Stop!
The double was yelling at the 2 scutters operating the cantilever crane.
Take it up again and swing it back round to where it came from. Excuse me, this is my area of responsibility. Swing it round, back to where it came from. Start again. Stop!
Yelled Rimmer. The crane shuddered and stopped. The huge ship swung back and forth in its harness.
No, swing it round,
the double countermanded.
We've got to start again. Stop! Round! What are you doing? This is my task. Haven't you got to rush off and have another huge, great big sleep on the quiet?
What? The double's face crinkled into a half-smile that announced he was lying.
I haven't been taking secret sleeps.
Oh, really? Rimmer sneered contemptuously and yelled for the scutters to stop again. The weight of the swinging ship wrenched the back legs of the crane off the deck. The crane moaned and tilted. The ship slithered out of its harness and plummeted the 400 yards onto the cargo deck below. The 2 Rimmers watched paralyzed as it bounced onto the steel deck before coming to rest tail up, dinted but structurally unharmed. The crane eased lazily forward, then smashed down onto the Nova 5's rear half, slicing it neatly in 2 like a split banana. Lister sat in the sealed cab of the earth remover, drumming his gauntleted fingers impatiently on the dashboard. After 4 days of exploratory digging, they'd finally found a thorium lode, and dug a trench 70 feet deep and 15 feet wide, which ran for a length of 30 yards. Once Lister had dug out enough 3-foot slabs of raw ore to fill the 8-wheeled Lunar Transport Vehicle, LTV, the Cat would then drive the thorium to the Portalab, where Crichton would scrape away the waste soil and clay, then pack the clean ore in sealed cases aboard Blue Midget, ready to be transported back to Red Dwarf for refining. At least that was the plan. But there were some hiccups in the procedure, and Lister was experiencing just one of those hiccups right now, as he sat in the digger at the bottom of the trench with a full load, waiting for the Cat to return with the LTV. So far, he'd been waiting for over an hour. He punched helplessly at the yellow furry dice dangling from the mirror and wondered if it would have been possible to find 2 more incompetent and useless assistants in the entire universe to help him mine for uranium. The 5th century Norwegian warrior King Havoc the Imbecile and his more idiotic half-brother were the only 2 that sprang readily to mind. The whole of the first day had been spent teaching the Cat how to drive the LTV. Initially, he had refused even to listen to Lister's instructions until the vehicle had been customized to his liking. Now, it was painted jet black, with 2 streaks of flame emanating from the wheel rims, 24 mirrors, tinted windows, and the cat's own face painted growling on the hood. Once the vehicle was to his taste, he'd managed to pick up the basic driving skills fairly quickly, and in fact could now do wheelies and handbrake turns even when loaded down with 3 tons of mineral ore. The dashboard intercom buzzed in Lister's digger. Lister pressed the send button.
"Where the smeg have you been? I've been trying to get through for an hour."
Fzzzt. "Lunch," said the cat's voice.
"Lunch? We just had lunch 2 hours ago."
Fzzzt. "Had it again," said the cat. This was one of the major hiccups in the operation. The cat insisted on taking regular breaks throughout the day. When he wasn't eating, he was snoozing. He took perhaps 7 or 8 snooze breaks every day, which he claimed were essential. Otherwise, he wouldn't have enough energy for his main evening sleep. When he wasn't eating or snoozing or sleeping, he was generally taking it easy. Lister had found him countless times aboard Blue Midget listening to music on Lister's headphones and idly thumbing his way through a sniff book. In an average 14-hour working day, the cat could be relied upon to put in 15 minutes hard graft. So Lister had found himself doing pretty much everything by himself. Crichton was terrific. A real godsend. Provided all you needed was a plateful of triangular-shaped cucumber sandwiches with the crusts removed and a pot of lemon tea. If, on the other hand, you needed someone to scrape uranium ore free of waste and pack it in sealed cases, all you got was another plateful of cucumber sandwiches and a second pot of lemon tea. Uranium recovery wasn't mechanoid work, he kept repeating. It was important and dangerous, and he couldn't accept the responsibility. And by way of a peace offering, he'd make another plate of sandwiches. Lister finally persuaded him it was just cleaning work. Slightly bizarre cleaning work, but cleaning work nevertheless. And eventually, he'd reluctantly agreed to do it. At the end of the 3rd day, when Lister had gone across to the Porter lab to see how he was doing, he found the huge stack of raw ore piled up largely untouched in the holding tanks. Inside, he found Crichton still working on his first piece of ore. "Almost done," said Crichton, spraying the uranium with just one more coat of beeswax and buffing it to a gleaming finish. Lister had banged Crichton's head with a handy piece of ore and explained how it was important to do it a little more quickly. Since then, he hadn't dared to go back and check on the mechanoid's progress. In the meantime, the cat was back from his latest break.
"Fzzzt. Back on the case now, buddy,"
came the cat's voice.
"Let's work."
The cat's LTV leapt off the brow of a dune, landed 20 feet beyond on its front wheels, ducking to the limit of its suspension, then reared back, its hood in the air, as the cat wheelied up to the trench, span on a sixpence, and came to rest in a cloud of black lunar dust in perfect parallel with Lister's digger.
"Fzzzt. I'm a natural,"
sighed the cat, patting his pompadour in the rearview mirror.
"Load me up. I have another snooze break due in 1 minute precisely."
Rimmer sat in the hard metal chair at the hard metal table, reading the strategic account of the Battle of Borodino, the critical battle in Napoleon's abortive advance on Moscow. He was taking full advantage of the 15-minute rest and recreation period at the end of another exhausting day. Lister's uranium party had been away now for 3 weeks, a full week over schedule. After the accident which smashed the Nova 5 into 3 pieces, the 2 Rimmers had gone into overdrive. 15 of the 84 scutters had exploded due to overwork. But at least the Nova 5 had been welded together so that it now lay in the original 2 pieces it had been before Lister left. After 3 weeks of back-breaking, scutter-blowing toil, they were finally back where they'd started. Rimmer looked up at his double, who was sitting in the quarter's one easy chair, bathed in the pink glow of the student's study lamp, studying the rude paintings of Renaissance women in their book on Florentine art. When he'd drunk in enough of one painting, he nodded at a scutter, who turned the page. It was funny, the original Rimmer thought, staring at his duplicate. He'd never realized before how big his Adam's apple appeared in profile, or how small and triangular his chin was. He'd never been aware that his nostrils flared so ludicrously, or that his nose twitched like a dormouse's whenever he was concentrating. It was a stupid-looking face, really. As he watched, his double slipped a hand into his pocket, felt around, and pretending to cough, surreptitiously popped a hologrammatic mint into his mouth.
Pathetic. Deeply, deeply pathetic, thought Rimmer. They're computer-simulated mints. There's no limit to their number. So why doesn't he offer me one?
Absently, he slipped his chin below the table line and sucked a hologrammatic boiled sweet from the line of 3 on his knee.
Because he's mean, he thought, sucking silently. He's pathologically mean.
The double looked up and gave Rimmer a watery half-smile, forcing him to return to his Napoleonic diaries. The duplicate wondered idly if Rimmer knew he was beginning to lose his hair on the back of his crown, and if he knew how small and triangular his chin looked from this angle, above that megalithic Adam's apple, which bobbed up and down ludicrously like a hamster caught in a garden hose. And why did he never offer him one of his boiled sweets? Why, instead, did he go through that absurd charade of ducking below the table and sucking them off his knee? He was mean. That was the top and bottom of it, pathologically so. Rimmer looked up again, and noticed his double watching him.
"Good book?"
he asked.
"Hmm?"
said the double, quickly swallowing his mint.
Yes, Florentine art."
Rimmer smirked.
"What's funny?"
"Nothing," said Rimmer, shaking his head.
"No, tell me, what is it?" "You're looking at the rude pictures of Renaissance women. I just think it's funny."
The double snorted, through his familiar lying half-smile.
"No, I'm not. I just happen to be intrigued by 16th century art. True, there are several saucy portrayals of the Madonna, sans fig leaf, as it were, but I don't particularly dwell on them." "Yes, you do. You're a freak for Renaissance bazongas, and the pair on page 78 in particular."
An anger tick tugged at the double's top lip.
"Do you really think I'm the sort of pathetic, sad, weaselly kind of person who could get erotically aroused by looking at paintings of matronly breasts?" "I do it, so you must do it," Rimmer said brightly. "It's just, obviously, I've never seen it from the outside before, and although it is sad, pathetic, and weaselly, I grant you, it's also tremendously amusing, especially the way you keep on getting the scutter to turn back to page 78 as if you've forgotten something. I don't have to sit here and take this. Yes, that's a good idea. Why don't you stand up and let me have a go on that chair?"
"Oh!" The double smiled and nodded.
"That's what this is all about." It's my favourite chair," Rimmer said petulantly, "and you always seem to hog it." "It's my favourite chair too," protested the duplicate. "I used to be able to sit on it all the time when I was with Lister. Now I'm with you, I'm relegated to this hard metal chair next to this hard metal table, and you get the pink student's light. Well, the pink student's light just happens to be next to the comfy chair. Which is why, once in a while, you might offer to let me sit there. Well, of all the stupid things to argue about, honestly. You're tired. I think you must be working too hard." "I'm not working too hard," Rimmer hissed. "I can take it." "Hey, it's no disgrace to need more than 2.5 hours sleep. True, a lot of the greatest people in history survived on 3 hours or under, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're a complete failure if you need 12 or 13. "I don't need 12 or 13. "Then why are you getting so ratty?" "I'm not getting ratty," Rimmer whined. "Why do you keep putting me down, then?"
A bitter silence descended on the room. The thing that Rimmer hated more than anything was being put down. Lister did it to him, the cat did it to him, and now he was doing it to himself. Rimmer began to regret his outburst. He didn't like to see his other self upset, and he even contemplated briefly going up to him and giving him a manly embrace. But in a brief moment of homosexual panic, he thought his double might get the wrong idea. Not that he would, of course, because he was him, and he knew for a fact that he wasn't that way sexually tilted. So obviously his double wasn't, and obviously his double would know that he wasn't either, and it was simply a manly embrace, meant in a sort of mano a mano kind of way. Perhaps he was tired. He certainly had good reason. He'd had only 10 hours sleep in the last 21 days. He was practically hallucinating with fatigue. And whose fault was that? His double's? Rimmer didn't know how it had started, but somehow they'd got involved in a kind of tougher-than-you game. Every time Rimmer suggested a schedule that was reasonably testing, his double would have to top it. And Rimmer could hardly let him get away with that, so he'd suggest something even more difficult, and then his duplicate would top that too. Now, after 21 days of this, they were down to 1.5 hours sleep a night. All he needed was a lie-in. 2 or 3 days in bed, and he'd be his old self again. It made sense. They'd blown up the scutters and broken the ship. If they'd spent the last 3 weeks in bed doing absolutely nothing at all, they'd be in exactly the same position as they were now. He decided to suggest they take a couple of days off. Who cared if his copy saw it as a sign of weakness? He'd suggest it anyway.
"I was thinking," he said aloud, "about tomorrow's getting up time." "So was I," said his double. "How about tomorrow we only have 1 hour 15 minutes? "How about 1 hour?"
Rimmer found himself saying automatically.
"No, better still," said his double. 45 minutes.
Rimmer shut up and wished he'd never spoken. Blue Midget headed at breakneck speed towards the metal wall of the Red Dwarf's hull. Just before impact, it flattened out and hugged the body of the ship before twisting into a loop-de-loop and zipped smoothly in through the open doors of the cargo bay. It twisted side over side like a torpedo before flipping upright and coming to rest on the landing pad. Lister eyeballed the cat. "That's the last time you drive," he said. They clambered down the boarding steps and stood on the deck of the cargo bay. There before them, the Nova 5 lay in one gleaming hole. Repaired, finished, and space-worthy. Lister was stunned. True, they had been away almost 3 months, collecting enough thorium-232 for the jag home, but the Rimmers had done it. They'd actually done a job and not screwed it up. It was only at a second glance that Lister became aware of the burnt-out husks of 80 or so exploded scutters surrounding the ship. From the Nova 5's hatchway, a lone scutter slowly emerged with a welding laser in its tired claw, and made its way unsteadily down the boarding ramp and onto the cargo bay floor. It glided painfully across the deck, emitting a dangerous whining sound, and arrived in front of Lister, Crichton, and the cat. It tilted its head like a quizzical dog, and exploded in an orange flare. The 3 of them clumped noisily down the gantry steps onto the habitation deck, and were halfway to the sleeping quarters when they heard the voices. "Shh!" Lister held up his hand. Faintly at first, then gradually increasing in clarity, the sound of a heated argument filtered down the corridor.
"What did you call me?" "I said you were a bonehead, bonehead." "I'm a what?" "It's no wonder Father despised you." "I was his favourite. His favourite boneheady, wimpy wet." "You filthy, smegging liar. Everyone hated you, even Mother." "Pardon?" "You're a hideous emotional cripple, and you know it." "Shut up!" "What other kind of man goes to android brothels and pays to sleep with robots?" "That wasn't me!" "Of course it was you! I'm you, I know! Shut up! You've always been afraid of women, haven't you? Shut up!"
The argument had begun at 8 o'clock, shortly after supper. It was now 5 hours later, and it was showing no signs of abating. Neither of them could remember why it had begun, or indeed what it was about. They just knew they disagreed with one another. It was all out verbal warfare. They'd gone beyond the snidey sniping stage. They'd gone past the quasi-reasonable stage, whereby each pretended to put his case coolly and logically, and would begin with phrases such as, "What I'm saying is," "The point I'm making is," and prevent the other from speaking with the perennial, "If you just let me finish." They had made exactly the same points in a variety of different ways for nearly 2 hours before tiredness crept in, and the argument turned into a nuclear war. Rimmer's double had launched the first nuke, the bonehead remark. Bonehead, Rimmer's nickname at school. He was really quite irrationally sensitive about it. The word yanked him back to the unhappy schoolyards, reminded him of the mindless taunts of his cruel peers, of the dreadful mornings when he ached to be ill so he wouldn't have to go on the green school shuttle and have that word daubed on his blazer in yellow chalk. He was branded. It was a brand that might fade, but would never completely disappear. He might be 80 years old and successful as hell, and bump into an old classmate, and he would still be Bonehead. Before the double had launched the Bonehead nuke, Rimmer was unquestionably on top in the argument. The double had said something stupid, and Rimmer had been at the stage of saying, "Give me an example of that," knowing full well there were no examples to give. He was strutting up and down in his pajamas, arms folded, a man in control, a man in command, when the Bonehead nuke looped across without warning and blew him away. "Pardon me, Bonehead?" Rimmer actually physically staggered. Their arguments had never escalated this far before. They'd gone up to DEFCON 3, but never passed it. Rimmer had to employ the time-honored device of pretending not to have heard him properly, while his psyche's lone bugler sounded muster, and his tattered thoughts tried to regroup and launch an offensive. But his double had capitalized on Rimmer's temporary silence by immediately launching 3 follow-up nukes in quick succession. The one about his father hating him, kaboom! The one about him being a hideous emotional cripple, kaboom! And the one about him being afraid of women, kababoom! Rimmer was about to use a nuke of his own. His left leg had gone into a spasm, caused by rage. His eyes were wide and crazed, and he didn't care anymore. He was going to use the nuke. The nuke to end all nukes, the total annihilation device, when his double used it instead.
"Oh, shut up!"
The duplicate sneered.
"Mr. Gazpacho!"
Rimmer stood, his mouth half open, swaying dizzily. He felt as if someone had sucked out his insides with a vacuum cleaner. "Mr. what?" He half smiled in disbelief. "Mr. what?"
"I said, Mr. Gazpacho, Deafy!"
"That is the most obscenely hurtful thing anyone has ever said."
"I know!"
The double grinned evilly. Rimmer's hatchway slid open.
"That's the straw that broke the dromedary!"
Rimmer screamed back at his double. Then he turned and padded into the corridor, where Lister, Crichton, and the cat were standing. "Ah, Lister, you're back," he said quietly. Everything all right, is it?" Lister asked. "For sure," Rimmer smiled. "Absolutely." "No problems, then?" "Nope. Everything's A-OK. Yep, things couldn't really be much hunky-doryer. It's just, we heard raised voices." Rimmer laughed. "That's quite an amusing thought, isn't it? Having a blazing row with yourself." From the sleeping quarters, the double's voice screamed.
"Can you shut the smeg up, Rimmer? Some of us are trying to sleep!"
"I mean, obviously," Rimmer continued, ignoring the outburst, "we have the odd disagreement. It's like brothers. I mean, a little tiff, an exchange of views, but nothing malicious, nothing with any side to it." The double screeched.
"Shut up, you dead git!"
Rimmer smiled at Lister, and perfectly calm, he said, "Excuse me, I won't be a second." He walked slowly down the corridor, paused outside the hatchway, and bellowed at maximum volume.
"Stop your foul whining, you filthy piece of distended rectum!"
Lister, Crichton, and the cat shuffled uncomfortably and examined the floor. Look, it's pointless concealing it any longer, said Rimmer, walking back towards them. My duplicate and me, we've had a bit of a major tiff. I don't know how it started, but obviously it goes without saying, it was his fault. Lister's empty supper plate lay on the floor. Only the red, oily streaks of Bangalore fowl and half of his 7th poppadom, which he couldn't quite manage, bore evidence that he'd had a 5-course Indian banquet for one. Earth! As he lay on his bunk, cuddling his 8th can of leopard lager, Jimmy Stewart was asking the townfolk not to withdraw their money from the Bailey Building and Loan Company on the sleeping quarters vidscreen. Earth! He was watching Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, his all-time favourite movie, but he couldn't concentrate, even though it was his favourite scene. The Wall Street panic scene. The scene where Jimmy Stewart is trying to calm the hysterical mob, clamouring to withdraw all their money after the Wall Street crash. But the money isn't there. The money's invested in the people's houses. Then Jimmy Stewart offers them his honeymoon money. He offers to divide out the $2,000 he was going to spend on his honeymoon, to keep them going till the bank opened again on Monday. But the fat guy in the hat steps up to the counter and still demands all his money, $242, and Stewart has to pay it, and he's begging people just to take what they need. And then a woman comes up to the counter and says she can manage on $20. Then up steps old Mrs. Davis and asks for only $17.50, which was the point where Lister usually started to burble, and tears would sting his eyes, and he wouldn't dare look around the room in case anyone was watching him. But not this time. Earth! The movie was as great as ever, and he would never get tired of watching it, but he couldn't concentrate on anything because he knew he was finally going back home. Earth! He could taste it! The Nova 5 was fueled and ready to go. The small band of scutters they'd brought back from the mining expedition were making the final checks and loading supplies. Tomorrow they were leaving. Within weeks, Lister would be back on Earth. Earth! That septic orb, that dirty, polluted world he loved. He ached for the Brillo pad sting of a breath on a city street, the oh-so-delicious stench of the oily, turdy sea in summer, the grassy parks in spring, festooned with the thrilling, vibrant colours of discarded chocolate wrappers and squidgy condoms and squashed soft drink cans. He longed to look up at a winter sky and see again the huge artificial ozone plug which sat above the earth like an absurd toupee, constructed in his lifetime to repair the damage caused by 2 generations of people who wanted to flavour their sweat. Earth! It was a dump! It was a sty! But it was his home, where he belonged, and where he was finally going. He flicked off the vid and slipped down from his bunk. It was time to tell the Rimmers. It was time to tell them that when they left tomorrow on the Nova 5, only one of them could come. Rimmer had been avoiding himself since the argument. He didn't know how to begin a reconciliation conversation. Things had been said which... well, things had been said. Hurtful things, bitter, unforgivable things, which could never be forgotten. Equally, he couldn't just carry on as if nothing had happened. So he spent the day in the reference library, keeping out of everyone's way. It was 4:30 p.m. when he finally swallowed the bile and slumped reluctantly into his sleeping quarters, looking curiously unkempt. His hair was uncombed and unwashed. A 2-day hologrammatic growth swathed his normally marble-smooth chin. His uniform was creased and ruffled. He flopped untidily into the metal armchair. His double sat on the bunk, looking moodily out of the viewport window. As Rimmer entered, he'd looked round over his shoulder, then turned back without acknowledging him. They sat there in silence. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Bitter, accusing silence. They were both masters at using silence, and right now they were using it in a bitter, accusing way. After 20 minutes of stonewalling, Rimmer could take no more. "Look," he began. "I want to apologize for—" Rimmer faltered, uncertain as to precisely what he was supposed to apologize for. "I want to apologize for everything." Oh, shut up, his double said dismissively. Rimmer's eyes shrank, weasel small. You don't like me, do you? Even though I'm you, you don't actually like me. Even though we're the same person, you actively dislike me. His double turned from the window. We're not the same person. But we are. You're a copy of me. The double shook his head. I'm a recording of what you were, what you used to be. The man you used to be before the accident. You've changed. Lister's changed you. Lister changed him? Preposterous. I haven't changed. In what way have I changed? Well, for a start, you've just apologized. What was it his father used to say? Never apologize, never explain. I'm sorry, Rimmer apologized again. It's just, I want us to get on. Oh, don't be pathetic. Rimmer closed his eyes and leaned back on his chair. Was it just him? Was it some dreadful flaw in his personality that prevented him from having a successful relationship even with his own self? Or would it be the same for most people? Would most people find their own selves irritating and tiresomely predictable? When he saw his face in the mirror in the morning, that was the face he carried around in his head. He never saw his profile. He never saw the back of his own head. He didn't see what other people saw. It was the same with his personality. He carried around an idealized picture of himself. He was the smart, sensitive person who did this good thing or that good thing. He buried the bad bits. He covered up and ignored the flaws. All his faults were forgiven and forgotten. But now he was faced with them, all his shortcomings personified in his other self. Rimmer had never been aware how awesomely petty he was, how alarmingly immature, how selfish, how he could on occasion be incomprehensibly stupid, how sad he was, how screwed up and lonely. And he was seeing this for the first time. It was like the first time he'd heard his own voice on an answering machine. He expected to hear dulcet tones, clear, articulate and accentless, and was embarrassed and nauseated to discover only incoherent mumblings in some broad Ionian accent. In his head, he sounded like a newsreader. In reality, he sounded nasal and dull and constantly depressed. And meeting himself was the same, only worse, raised to the power of 1,000. And there were other things. He was at least 30% worse looking than he thought. He stooped. His right leg constantly jiggled, as if he wanted to be somewhere else. He snored. Not the loud buzzsaw of Lister. His own snore was, if anything, more irritating, a high-pitched whiny trill, like a large parrot being strangled in a bucket of soapy water. It was a terrible thing to admit, but he was reaching the devastating, inescapable conclusion that he, as a companion, was the very last person he wanted to spend any time with. Was this the same for everybody? Or was it just him? He didn't know. So lost was he in this train of thought that he was only vaguely aware of Lister coming into the room and announcing the Nova 5 could only sustain one hologram, and so one of the Rimmers would have to be switched off. Who was it going to be? He was asking. Who what? Asked Rimmer. Who's going to come on the Nova 5 and who's going to be turned off? Well, obviously I'm coming, said Rimmer. Why, obviously, said his double. Because I'm the original. I was here first. So what? We should toss for it. No, said Rimmer through a disparaging laugh. Why should I want to toss for it? I might lose. Lister took out a coin. Heads or tails? What? Said Rimmer. Fair's fair. You call. You expect me to call heads or tails as to whether or not I get erased? Rimmer's features fled to the perimeter of his face. No way. I stay. You're the same person. It's only fair. Call. Lister flipped the coin, caught it, and covered it with his hand. I'm not calling. I'll call, said the double. I'll call, Rimmer said firmly. Heads. No, tails. Tails, I mean. No, wait. Heads. Heads. It's tails, said Lister. You get erased.
I haven't finished deciding yet. I think I was going to choose tails. Yes, I was. Tails, in fact. Too late, said the double. Erase him. But I was here first, protested Rimmer. In a way, I created you.
What difference does it make? You're identical, Lister said. You're the same person.
But we're not,
Rimmer whined balefully.
Not anymore, we're not.
It was 4 a.m, and Rimmer sat on the bunk, his long arms wrapped around his spindly knees, his brain fighting off sleep. It was ironic, he thought, that he'd just about come to terms with having died, and now here he was, about to be erased forever. On the toss of a coin. But that was life, he thought. Life was the toss of a coin. You're born rich, you're born poor. You're born smart, you're born stupid. You're born handsome, you're born with a face like a post office clerk. Heads you are, tails you aren't. Rimmer felt that most of his life had come up tails. Relationships with women, tails. Career success, tails. Friendships, tails. His life, best out of 3, tails, tails, and tails. He'd never been in love, and now he never would be. He'd never been an officer, and now he never would be. He'd never be anything, because he was about to be erased. All right, there would still be an Arnold Rimmer, but it wasn't him. It was his so-called double. But he wasn't a double. They were different. He allowed himself an ironic snicker. He couldn't even succeed as being Arnold Rimmer. There were 2 of them, and he'd come second. Unbelievable. Unbesmegging-leavable. What had he learned from his life? What? Except keep your face out of the way of atomic explosions. Nothing. He'd learned nothing. What had he achieved? Again, nothing. His life was a goalless draw. In his entire life, 31 years alive and 1 year dead, he'd made love with a real live woman once. 1 time only. Uno. Ein. Un. Once. 1 raised to the power of 1. What Planck's constant can never be more than pi divided by itself. We're talking 1 here, me old buckaroo, he thought. Once. Yvonne Magruder, a single brief liaison with the ship's female boxing champion. March the 16th, 1931 hours to 1943 hours. 12 minutes. And that included the time it took to eat the pizza. In his whole life, he'd spent more time vomiting than he ever spent making love. Was that right? Was that fair? That a man should spend more time with his head down a lavatory than buried in the buttocks of the woman he loved? He'd always deluded himself that the problem was he hadn't met the right girl yet. Now, given the fact that the human race probably no longer existed, coupled with the fact that he had passed on, even he had to admit there was more than a possibility he was leaving it a little bit on the late side. He'd never had a break. Never. And so much of life was luck. Luck. If Napoleon had been born Welsh, would his destiny have been the same? If he'd been raised in Colwyn Bay, would he have been a great general? Of course he wouldn't. He'd have married a sheep and worked in the local fish and chip shop. But no. He'd had the luck to be born in Corsica, just at the right moment in history when the French were looking for a short, brilliant fascist dictator. Luck. Van Gogh. Wasn't it sheer good fortune that Van Gogh was born raving mad? Wasn't that why his cornfields looked like they did? Wasn't that why he did several hundred paintings of his old boots? Wasn't that why his paintings were so innovative? Because he had the happy chance to be born with a leak in the think tank. Luck. And what about John Merrick, the jammy bastard, born looking like an elephant? How can you fail? You just stand around while people goggle at you and you rake it in. He was too normal, that was his problem. Too ordinary, and normal, and healthy, and bland. A bit of madness, a spot of deafness, the looks of an elephant, and a birthplace like Corsica, and he could have been somebody. He could have been the deaf, mad, one-eared elephant Frenchman for a start. He stood up and paced around the room. His body wanted to sleep, but his mind wanted to rant. This was torture. It was death row. It was hell. If it was going to happen, he wanted to get it over with. He couldn't tolerate the agony of a day knowing everything he did he would be doing for the last time. Forget tomorrow. He wanted to be erased now.
Forget tomorrow, he said. I want to be erased now.
It's 4:30 in the morning, croaked Lister, scraping the fuzz off his tongue with his top teeth. Rimmer's duplicate sprang out of his bunk.
Great! Let's get it over with.
What do you think you're doing? Lister asked.
I'm coming to watch.
Lister shook his head. It's not a freak show. The double forced air through his teeth disappointedly.
There's precious little entertainment on this ship. If you can't attend the odd execution, what have you got left?
Lister started to get dressed. I'll see you in the disc library in 10 minutes. Rimmer nodded and left. When Rimmer arrived, Lister was already there, sitting in front of the generating console, clutching a mug of steaming black coffee and a jam donut brushed with sugar.
Great,
thought Rimmer.
Come to my execution. Light refreshments available.
Fancy a drink? Said Lister, sipping at his rum-laced coffee. Rimmer grunted in the negative. He was wearing his best blue first technician boiler suit, with a row of worn-looking medals dangling over the spanner pocket. I didn't know you had any medals. What are they? Rimmer pointed to the first medal with his forefinger.
3 years long service.
He tapped the second.
6 years long service.
He touched the third.
9 years long service, and...
He hesitated, his finger over the final medal, as if remembering.
And, 12 years long service.
Lister didn't smile. Come on, one drink. Rimmer capitulated.
I'll have a whiskey.
Holly simulated a large shot of Glen Fujiyama, and Rimmer took it in one belt. Another? Rimmer nodded, unable to speak, feeling as if the lining of his larynx had been stripped like wallpaper. A second malt arrived in a hologrammatic glass. He tipped it into his mouth. Rimmer was totally unused to drink. His face glowed brightly. His hair seemed to uncoil and hang onto his face. He swept it back with both his hands and sighed a long, world-weary sigh. A sigh that had been inside him trying to get out for 31 years. He unfurled himself into a spare monitor seat and jiggled his right leg impatiently.
Come on, let's go. Let's do it. Come on, turn me off. Let's do it. Erase me. Wipe me clean. Let's go.
Lister finished his donut and dusted the sugar off his hands. So, what's this big thing about gazpacho soup? He said, casually taking a throatful of coffee.
How do you know about gazpacho soup?
I heard the end of the argument, and you've been yelling about it in your sleep ever since I joined up. I just wonder what it was.
Ah! Wouldn't you like to know?
Yeah, I would like to know.
I bet you would, Listy. I bet you would.
Are you going to tell me? Rimmer wagged his finger.
Secret!
Go on, tell me.
I can't. It's too terrible.
Rimmer clasped his hands and rested them between his splayed knees, his back hunched, his eyes fixed on the rubber matting of the floor. He shook his head.
I can't tell you. I'd like to tell you, but I can't.
Why? Rimmer's eyebrows plaited.
You're right. What's the difference? What does it matter now? Now I'm going to be erased. You want to know about gazpacho soup? I'll tell you.
He flung his head back and closed his eyes, and started to tell Lister about the greatest night of his life.
It was the greatest night of my life, he began. Every Friday evening, the captain held a formal dinner in her private dining room in her quarters. Just a few of the top officers and their partners, and one, maybe two of the boys and girls to watch. The young Turks, the up-and-comers, the people who were happening. I'd only been with the company 5 months, and the invitation hit the mat. I knew what it was before I opened it. The captain requests the pleasure of the company of Mr. A.J. Rimmer and guest. 8:30 for 9. Black tie, long dress. RSVP. We were in orbit round Ganymede. It was a long-term dock for repairs. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a partner, and I didn't know any women well enough to ask them. So, on the Friday morning, I caught the shuttle, found the best escort agency on Ganymede, and hired... Rimmer's eyes milked over. She was gorgeous. Nothing I can say now can begin to indicate how truly dynamite this girl was. She made Marilyn Monroe look like a hippo. She was at the university doing a PhD in stellar engineering, and did the escort thing for extra money. She had 4 degrees. One of the degrees was in something I couldn't even pronounce. That's how smart she was. I paid the agency fee, which was a lot. I mean, a lot. And then I tipped her double to pretend we were dating on a regular basis and to act as if she was crazy about me. Only in public. Rimmer waved his hand, as if to ward off evil thoughts. There was no funny business. Oh, how I longed for the funny business. But that wasn't the deal. It was all above board. We went shopping, and I bought her a dress. Not just a dress. A dress. It probably cost about the same as the entire NASA budget for the 21st century. I had to write extra small to fit all of the numbers into the box of my checkbook. Then, he made a trilling sound with his tongue. Then we went out and picked out a tuxedo for me. She went home to get changed, and we arranged to meet at the shuttleport at 6. 7 o'clock, she still hasn't shown up. I phone up the escort agency, which in the meantime has turned into a Chinese restaurant. I try the university. What do you know? There is no university on Ganymede. I've been had. I've been taken. I've blown 3 months' salary, and I haven't even got a date. I can't believe it. I catch the 7:30 shuttle back to Red Dwarf. I ask all 5 air hostesses, but they say they're all on duty and can't come. So there's nothing for it. I have to go on my own. I'm humiliated before I walk in the door. So, I turn up at the captain's quarters completely by myself. Everyone else has got partners. The table is all set, with place names. I have to spend the whole evening sitting opposite an empty chair. They ask me where my date is, and I panic, and tell them she was killed in a road accident earlier in the evening, but I'm over it now. We sit down, and dinner begins. I'm feeling like I've got off to a really bad start, so I'm trying desperately to be charming as Smeg, but no one's warming to me. Then I remember the joke. Ledbetter told me this joke about a bear trapper in Alaska. It was funny, it was clean, it was perfect for the dinner party. Originally, I was going to save it for the mince and coffee, but by this time I'm feeling I might not even make it to the mince and coffee. The empty chairs staring back at me, and the rest of the guests are convinced my girlfriend's lying in some morgue somewhere while I go out to a dinner party. So I decide now is the time to tell the joke. And I'm telling the joke, and it's a long joke, and I'm suddenly aware no one's talking, and everybody's watching me telling the joke. And I'm very self-conscious all of a sudden, and I can feel my ears. I'm suddenly really aware of my ears, and the back of my neck starting to prickle. Suddenly, for no reason at all, I forget the end. I forget the punchline. I forget how it finishes. I just stop talking. And everyone's still looking at me. I have to say, I'm very sorry, but that's as much as I remember. There's this pause. Horrible pause. Horrible, horrible. And I can see the captain's boyfriend looking at me with pity in his eyes, because she thinks I'm half crazy with grief. And everyone starts talking, but not to me. Then the stewards wheel in the first course. It's soup. Gazpacho soup. While they're serving, I'm studying the cutlery. I bought this etiquette book, and I know 2 things. 1, never wear diamonds before lunch, and 2, with cutlery, start from the outside and work your way in. I start from the outside. I start so far from the outside, I inadvertently take the spoon of the woman sitting next to me. Eventually, we sort it out and start to eat. My soup is cold. I mean, stone cold. I look up. Everyone else's appears to be fine. Here's my chance to make a mark. I call over the steward, and very discreetly tell him my soup is cold.
He looks at me like I'm something he's just scraped off his shoe. He takes the soup away and brings it back hot. Everyone starts laughing. I start laughing too. And the more I laugh, the more they laugh. He stopped and turned his closed eyes to the ceiling. He smiled through clenched teeth, and then, as if every word were punctuated by the pulling of a dagger from his heart, inch by agonizing inch, he said, "I didn't know gazpacho soup was meant to be served cold." His head slumped forward again, and he carried on. "And by now they're hysterical, uncontrollable. I still think they're laughing at the steward, when all the time they're laughing at me as I eat my piping hot gazpacho soup." The memory washed over him like a wave in an acid sea. He bathed in its flesh-stripping agony. He cleared his throat. "That was the last time I ate at the captain's table." Rimmer opened his eyes. They'd been closed throughout the entire story. "That evening was pretty much the end of my career." There was a silence. "Is that it?" Lister said eventually. "Is that what you've been torturing yourself with for the last 7 years? One dumb mistake that anybody could have made?" "If only they'd mentioned it in basic training, instead of climbing up ropes and crawling through tunnels on your elbows. If just once they'd said, 'Gazpacho soup is served cold,' I could have been an admiral by now. I really could." "Come on. Everybody has memories that make them wince. And 99% of the time, the only person who remembers the incident is you."
"Oh, what does it matter now? Come on, let's get it over with. Erase me."
"And those things nearly always happen with people you don't know very well and don't see very often, so who gives a smeg anyway?"
"Just turn me off. Get on with it."
Lister swigged at his now cold coffee. "I've already done it. I wiped the other one." Emotions wrestled for space on Rimmer's brow.
"You wiped the duplicate? When?"
"Before you walked in."
"And you let me stand here and spill my guts?"
"Yeah." A big, broad grin.
"Why?"
"I wanted to find out about gazpacho soup, and I knew you'd never tell me."
"Of course I wouldn't tell you, because you'd make my life hell with gazpacho soup jokes for the rest of eternity."
"Rimmer, I swear I will never mention this conversation again." Rimmer regarded him dubiously. "I don't break me word. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a liar." Rimmer looked at him through one eye.
"All right, then. I believe you. You're a disgusting, rancid slob, but you keep your word."
"Thank you." Rimmer got up from the chair.
"So, I'm going back to Earth, then?"
Lister nodded. "We're all going back to Earth, then?" Rimmer motioned drunkenly towards the hatchway.
"Come on. Let's go down the Copacabana and have a real drink."
Lister got up to follow him. "Super," he said. Strange, but years later, whenever Lister remembered it, he always remembered it in black and white. And something else. The memories came in a rush. There were no insignificant details, only significant ones. He remembered his scalp tingling as the cargo bay doors boomed open. He remembered his giddiness as the Nova 5 taxied across the cargo deck and blasted into the blackness of space. He remembered the silvery light that preceded each jump, and the incomparable feeling of existing at 2 points in the universe simultaneously, and then the jolt, as all his cells decided to be in the new position. Perhaps 1,000 jolts. And there it was, on the Navicomp screen. The planet Earth. They were home. The big clock on the wall tocked round to 5 o'clock, and Lister flipped up the flap on the counter and turned the sign on the door to closed. Bailey's Perfect Chamois Kebab Emporium was shutting for the day. Lister rung up "No sale" on the old-fashioned wrought-iron till and counted the week's takings. $14.25. Another great week. He dipped his hand into the penny candy jar, picked out a licorice shoelace, then grabbed his overcoat and scarf, pulled on his fur-lined deerstalker and mittens, and walked out into the crisp, white snow. The bell on the door jangled behind him. There was never any need to lock the shop. Not here in Bedford Falls. There was only one cop for the entire population of 3,000, and he spent most of his day asleep in his patrol car. Lister crunched across the eider-down street, chewing happily on his licorice, and headed for the bank. A group of carol singers were standing round the war memorial, belting out "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen," accompanied by a 4-piece brass band. They all waved a cheery greeting, and Lister stood with them and helped them finish his favourite carol. "Merry Christmas," he said, and dropped $2 into their can as Ernie the cab driver produced a hip flask from the bell of his tuba and gave Lister a nip of brandy. It being after 5 o'clock and Christmas Eve, the bank was closed, of course. Lister tried the door. It jangled open. "Hello? Anybody home?" Money was stacked in neat piles on the wooden counter. Obviously Horace hadn't got round to putting it in the safe yet. "Horace, are you there?" Horace stepped through the back door, holding a sheet of wrapping paper and some string.
"Sorry, Mr. Bailey. I was just wrapping presents for the kids up at the orphan home. You ever try to wrap a hula hoop? I'll be a monkey's uncle if I can figure it."
Lister handed over $10 and asked Horace to put it in his account.
$10? Business is good, Mr. Bailey."
Lister smiled and pulled out a handful of candy walking sticks from his huge overcoat pocket. "I didn't have time to wrap them. Hope the orphanage doesn't mind."
"They won't mind, George. Merry Christmas."
"Merry Christmas, Horace," said Lister, and turned to go. "You know, you should get a lock for this bank door sometime."
"That's what everybody says, but I figure what the heck? I'd only lose the key."
Lister laughed and walked back out into the street. Last-minute shoppers exchanged Merry Christmases with him as he crossed back to the Emporium where his rickety old Model A Ford was covered in snow. He took the hand crank from the bench seat and jerked the engine into spluttering life. As he turned left at Martini's bar, his arms started to hurt again, so he pulled over outside Old Man Gower's drugstore. His arms had been giving him problems for a few weeks now. It was like a burning sensation down both his forearms, excruciatingly painful at times, but Doc Mackenzie couldn't find anything wrong with them. There were no marks. Nothing showed up on the X-ray. It was a complete mystery. He grabbed a tub of cooling ointment from Old Man Gower's shelves and dropped 25 cents into the open till, then hopped back in his old Ford and headed for home, 220 Sycamore. A couple of birds, robins, Lister guessed, were singing in the snow-laden lilac trees that lined the avenue. Life was good. Everything seemed, well, perfect. But God, did his arms hurt. It had been 2 years since they returned to Earth. 2 years since the Nova 5 had completed the duality jumps which brought them back to their own solar system. 2 years since they'd skidded to a landing in the middle of the Sahara Desert. As they'd opened the airlock and stepped out into the baking heat, there, like a mirage, over the brow of a vast dune, an army of jeeps and helicopters had descended on them. The world press went crazy. The 3-million-year-old men, space adventurers. Things hadn't changed that much. The human race was still there, a foot or so taller, but still there. And so was everything that went with the human race. Advertising, commercialism, marketing, huge dirty cities and people on the make. And it had turned into a freak show. Interviews, book offers, chat shows, endorsements, sponsorship deals. Lister had hated it. He was a piece of meat that people wanted to package and sell. I'm 3 million years old. What's me secret? I eat Breadman's fish fingers. I've been all around the universe and I've never come across anything quite as good as Luton's carpet shampoo. Rimmer lapped it up. The cat adored it, but Lister just wanted to get away. He turned down all the offers, changed his name, and opted for the peaceful anonymity of this backwater town in the American Midwest. He couldn't believe it when he discovered there actually was a town called Bedford Falls. He'd gone there on a whim to take a look, and was stunned how similar the place was to the Bedford Falls in It's a Wonderful Life. It seemed like fans of the film had all collected there to live out their lives in a self-created 1940s American Shangri-La. Of course, he couldn't keep his secret from the townfolk for long. His face had been plastered all over magazine covers and newspapers for 6 months, so he guessed more or less everyone knew who he was and where he'd come from. But they pretended they didn't. They all called him Mr. Bailey, or George, which was the pseudonym he'd chosen. They respected his privacy and guarded his secret, and he was left in peace to live out the rest of his life in this quiet idyll. But something was wrong with his arms, and it was beginning to worry him. He turned the Ford into the tree-lined drive of his old house and honked his horn 3 times. The snow lay thick and deep on the lawn, and a huge 8-foot snowman was grinning a welcome in coal. Lister grabbed the Christmas presents off the back seat and staggered under their weight up the drive to the porch. As he pushed open the door with his back, he could hear a carol being mutilated on their clapped-out old piano. He loved that sound. To Lister, it was better than the London Phil. He walked into the parlour. A log fire was burning merrily in the grate. Jim and Bexley were smashing Silent Night out of the complaining piano, while Chrissy was standing on a stepladder, putting tinsel on the Christmas tree. She turned and smiled and blew him a kiss. After the kids were in bed, they sat snoozily in the big leather armchair, with the springs poking through the back, watching the fire splutter and splurt, and listening to Hoagie Carmichael on the wind-up phonograph. After Chrissy climbed the stairs to their draughty bedroom with a leaky roof, he took out the ointment. He didn't want her to know about his arms, and began to apply it to the sore areas. It came as something of a shock that when he'd put the cream specifically on the areas that throbbed and hurt, it spelt out a word written in pain down his forearm. The word was dying. The black stretch Mercedes with the tinted bulletproof glass glided along the Champs-Élysées and pulled up outside the canopy of the 140-floor skyscraper. Rimmer finished his phone call to his publicist, then stepped out of the limo. A string of bodyguards kept at bay the group of teenage girls who'd camped out on the steps overnight in the hope of catching a glimpse of AJR. He allowed them a thin smile as he walked under the canopy and up the marble steps into the Rimmer Building, Paris. The Rimmer Building, Paris, was an identical copy of the Rimmer Building, London, and the Rimmer Building, New York. He was happy with the towering glass and steel architecture, so he saw no need to vary the design. The electric doors purred open, and he strode across the thick white mink carpet, trailed by the gaggle of accountants and financial advisers who seemed to follow him everywhere. As he walked across the massive lobby, he dismissed his financial advisers for the evening and nodded almost imperceptibly at Pierre, the Sorbonne graduate he'd hired exclusively to press the button that summoned the lift. As he waited, he swung round to look at the colossal white marble statue of himself, captured in the middle of a full double Rimmer, which the Space Corps had long accepted as its standard official salute. The lift took a full 90 seconds to arrive, so he fired Pierre and pressed the button himself for floor 140, his luxury penthouse suites. The fact that he could actually press the button at all was, in a way, the key to the immense fortune he'd amassed since his return to Earth 2 years previously. After the hero's welcome, his cunning business brain had taken full advantage of the offers which had flooded in daily. With the money he culled from advertising and the publication of his memoirs, he'd set up various multinational corporations which had sponsored the Rimmer research centers, which had finally invented the solid-gram, a solid body which housed his personality and intellect. He was now exactly like any normal living person, with the added bonus that he was more or less immortal. The solid-gram had sold in such quantities, his income from that alone allowed him to buy the Bahamas for somewhere to go at the weekends. It amused him no end that he was now one of the 3 or 4 richest men in the world, while Lister was stuck in a dead-end burger bar in a dead-end town somewhere in the middle of nowhere. He'd hired a private investigator who had taken 14 months to track him down. Rimmer was now well into the complicated negotiations to buy up the entire town, which he intended to turn into a huge maggot farm, just for the hell of it. He got out of the lift and walked past the salute-shaped pool on the roof garden. Hugo, one of the gardening staff, was aquavacking cherry blossoms from the surface of the water.
"Monsieur Rimmer,"
he called.
"Madame Juanita, she is unwell again."
Rimmer sighed. Unwell was the code for throwing a major Brazilian wobbly. His wife was having one of her regular tantrums. Juanita Chicata was unquestionably the most beautiful woman in the world. Everything about her was classic, from the tip of her perfect nose to the toes of her beautiful feet. Eyes the color of fire, panther black hair, dangerous lips. Dangerous woman. She'd made 2 fortunes. The first as the world's #1 model, the second as the world's #1 actress. And she was a great actress. She wasn't a model who got by on her looks. She really was the finest actress in the world. And she was 19 years old. She had beauty, brains, talent, everything. God had finally got it right. Every man desired her. And she'd married Rimmer 2 summers earlier. This was another source of amusement for Rimmer. While Lister had ended up with a very ordinary girl-next-door type, he'd acquired the Brazilian bombshell. Right now, the Brazilian bombshell was exploding in the master bedroom of their penthouse apartment. Rimmer wandered through the exotic Chinese roof garden, while 400 catering staff prepared for the customary Saturday night party. The marquee had been erected overlooking the glistening Seine. The 40,000 fireworks were all in place and primed. The 300-yard-long buffet table was crammed to overflowing with food which had been flown in from around the world earlier that day, the centerpiece of which was a replica of Juanita's naked body in caviar. He paused to admire it. Even like this, even sculpted from little black fish eggs, it was a body that drove him crazy. He couldn't help himself. He leaned over and nibbled at her splendid right breast. The real ones were insured for 10 million each, and she hadn't let him near them for over a year and a half. Which was why, right now, Rimmer had his face buried deep in the ice-cold caviar. Suddenly, from above, there was a shattering of glass as a Louis XIV grand piano crashed out of the French windows of their master bedroom and landed on the roof garden, crushing one of the catering staff. It had amused Rimmer when the private detective reported that Lister had a piano, a clapped-out, tuneless wreck with dry rot, which Lister had bought at a second-hand shop in Bedford Falls for $4.30. Rimmer's piano, which now lay in pieces on top of a screaming servant, had cost him $1 million. It was a lot to pay for a piano that nobody played, but his wife thought it would look kinda neat in the bathroom, so he'd got it. Now, of course, it wasn't worth the price of a cup of tea, because she'd hurled it out of the window because she was unwell. Juanita was regularly unwell, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week, and on each occasion it cost Rimmer upwards of $300,000. Still, he could afford it. And she was the most beautiful woman alive. And she was married to him. As he walked into the master bedroom, he found Juanita hurling dollops of cold cream at an original Picasso, while 2 maids swept up the remains of the 5th-century Ming vase that she'd used to smash the nose of the Michelangelo statue he'd bought her as a kiss-and-make-up gift. Rimmer sighed and shook his head. Why had she gone crazy this time? What was the reason for today's little sulk? Was it because, for the second month on the row, she wasn't on the cover of Vogue? Was it because she was on the cover of Vogue and she didn't like the photograph? Was it because she put on a pound in weight? Or had she lost a pound in weight? Both, of course, disastrous. Had the maid accidentally brought up lapsang tea instead of keema? Last time she did that, it had cost Rimmer 3 Matisses and his entire collection of Iranian pottery. Was the telephone dirty again? Was there nothing on TV she wanted to watch? Whatever it was, she was obviously upset, because now she had taken down Rimmer's 12th century samurai sword and was hacking away at the waterbed. The liquid gurgled happily over the irreplaceable Persian rug. "Nita, Nita," he cooed soothingly as he sploshed over towards her. "What is it? What has disturbed my little turtle dove?" She turned to face him, ferocious, the samurai sword clasped above her head.
I can't tell you. You wouldn't understand it.
She skewered a Cézanne hanging above the bed and sliced it into thin shreds. "You can tell me anything," Rimmer said softly.
Not this. I can't tell you this.
"Please, tell me what's made you so angry."
Hugo!
She screeched, and at the mention of his name, she hurled the Koh-i-Noor out of the window and down onto the Champs-Élysées below. "What about Hugo?" said Rimmer, picking up the phone to make arrangements for the poolman's dismissal.
He won't make love to me anymore,
she bawled. Then she collapsed into a sobbing heap on the soggy mess of the demolished waterbed.
Not ever. He's afraid you'll find out and sack him.
"Well, he's got a point," Rimmer found himself saying. Then it hit him. What she'd said. He was stunned. He felt sick. He was nauseated. His wife? Unfaithful? Juanita and Hugo? His hairy-shouldered pool attendant had caressed that fabulous bosom? What would the insurance company say? His wife had slept with his pool attendant. No wonder the water was never at the right temperature. Rimmer felt numb. Lister sat in the red glow of the firelight and looked down at his arms, and the messages in ointment on each of them. How was it possible for pain to spell out words? What was it? Was it something inside him? The message on his left arm. Dying. What did that mean? He was dying? That something inside him was dying? He looked across at his right arm. 4 letters and a symbol. But he didn't know what they meant. Could it be that it was just a coincidence that the pain happened to spell out 2 messages that happened to be in English on his forearms? Unlikely, but not impossible. After all, some fairly bizarre things had happened since he returned to Earth. Finding Bedford Falls, the way he'd always imagined it. Finding someone who was the exact duplicate of Christine Kochanski. Exact, down to the pinball smile, down to the laugh, down to the tiny mole on her bottom, who just happened to be a direct descendant of the 3rd console officer he'd had an affair with aboard Red Dwarf 3 million years ago, who just happened to fall in love with him almost instantly and give him 2 twin sons. And the boys, both beautiful, both perfectly formed, never any trouble. They never cried, they never whined, they even changed one another's nappies. Wasn't that a bit odd? Self-nappy-changing babies? Lister didn't know much about babies, but Chrissy had always accepted it as normal behavior, so he had too. Also, he didn't know exactly when babies started to walk and talk, but Jim and Bexley were only 15 months old, yet they could play the piano, converse like adults, and even toss a 0G ball about with him in the back garden. Previously, he'd never given these things much thought. His life was pretty much perfect. He had everything he wanted, and what was the use in worrying about how lucky he'd been? The Emporium, that was another peculiar thing. Now he came to think of it, every week he always took $14.25, which, as it happened, was the exact amount he needed to pay for his mortgage, $3, food, $2, Petrol, 25 cents. The rent on the shop, $1.50. Savings, $5, leaving $3.50, which he could give to people in trouble. He got up and started pacing on the threadbare carpet. He didn't like where his thoughts were leading him. How many times had it been Christmas Eve since he arrived at Bedford Falls? 500, 600? In fact, wasn't it always Christmas Eve? How was that possible? Bexley padded down the stairs in his Donald Duck sleep suit and goofy slippers.
Hi, Dad. Jim wants a drink of milk. We've run out. Is it okay if I get some?
Lister looked at his 15-month-old son as he struggled into his quilted jumpsuit. He was big for his age. There was no question. 15 months he could talk and dress himself. He was precocious.
I'm just going to pop down to Old Man Gower's,
he said, tugging on his Wellingtons.
Do you want anything?
Lister shook his head. Bexley stood on tiptoe and opened the front door. Lister heard the Model A Ford start up as Bexley roared off into town. Everyone thought it was funny that Bexley could drive Lister's car. Obviously it was illegal, but Bert the cop thought it was funny too.
He's a better driver than me,
he used to say.
Why should I stop him?
Now that was weird. A 15-month-old baby driving into town to get some milk for his brother. It was barely believable. Well, it wasn't believable. It was impossible. Lister looked down at the message on his right arm. 4 letters, 1 symbol. A chill passed through him. He knew what it meant. U equals BTL. He knew what it meant. It was a gloriously warm summer's evening, with just enough breeze to make it perfect. The Rimmers were having a party. Arnie and Juanita were entertaining, and anybody who was anybody, and anybody who was one day going to be anybody, was there. The 400-piece New York Philharmonic Orchestra, flown in especially for the evening, were playing a tribute to James Last. The prima donnas from the Bolshoi Ballet were arranged around the roof garden in gilded cages, spinning and pirouetting to entertain the guests. 5,000 guests in all. The men in black DJs and the women in fabulously outrageous ball gowns mingled among the flocks of pink flamingos Rimmer had hired for the evening. Rimmer sat in his white dinner suit under the shade of a giant parasol, sipping a glass of 1799 Chateau Yquem, holding court to only the most famous and influential. A waiter was serving soup from a giant golden tureen. One of the guests, a member of the British royal family, was complaining that the soup was cold. Rimmer leaned over and whispered discreetly in his ear that it was gazpacho soup, and gazpacho soup was always served cold. It was Spanish. "Well, I didn't know that," said the Prince of Wales. Rimmer waved his hand in a desultory fashion to dismiss the poor man's embarrassment. "Not many people do." Rimmer caught sight of the swimming pool, and it plunged him back into his depression. A fluttering started in his stomach. He loved his salute-shaped pool, but he'd never been able to look at it again without thinking of Hugo the pool attendant. Hugo the caresser of $20 million bosoms. He'd dismissed him, of course, then made a few phone calls. Never again would Hugo be able to use a credit card. Never again would he shop at any Marks & Spencer's branch in the entire solar system. And buying shoes from any of the companies in the Burton Group he would find strangely impossible. Getting his hair cut anywhere in France would be out of the question. And a certain canned food company, beginning with H, had guaranteed that a certain individual, also beginning with H, would never be sold any of their products in the future. Never again would the wretched man ever enjoy beans on toast. At least, not really good beans on toast. Only inferior supermarket brands. Not in itself punishment to rival the auto-da-fés, but Rimmer had barely begun pulling the strings and calling in the favours which would ensure Hugo's life became unbearable. Rimmer heard Juanita's tinkling laugh, and as he peered through the milling party guests, He caught a tantalizing glimpse as she stood on the Chinese bridge over the pool, dazzling some producer with her wit and beauty. He froze. She was wearing that outfit. The one he'd expressly forbidden her to wear. The glass brassiere with the live goldfish swimming inside. The thin red belt, and nothing else. Just the diamond high heels and the gold anklet. A red belt. That's all she was wearing. He shook with rage. She was uncontrollable. Everything was on display. Everything. For all the guests to see.
But it's so chic,
she'd argued.
Adrian created it especially for me. You're such a prude.
The more he'd screamed at her to put some clothes on, the more determined she'd been to wear it. To wear it and humiliate him. Her only gestures to modesty were the 2 goldfish, one in each bra cup, and they could hardly be relied on to stay in a nipple-covering position all the time. He hated her. But he loved her. The Brazilian bombshell. What could he do? She drove him crazy. But he was stuck with it. The 3rd richest man in the whole of the world had a wife who wore a couple of goldfish at dinner parties. He tried to rip his eyes away from her, and back to the game of Risk he was playing with his 3 favourite dinner guests. It was Julius's go. With his yellow counters, he'd established a foothold in Africa, and was poised to throw the dice and attack southern Europe, where Rimmer's blue counters had their second front. The 3rd player, the Frenchman with the kiss curl, looked on earnestly. If the yellow assault should succeed, he could break out of South America with his red counters and swamp George's green counters, which were massed in the USA. Julius shook the dice and rolled 3 threes. Rimmer rolled 2 fours. Julius attacked, and Rimmer defended, until the yellow hordes had been reduced to only 2 counters. The Italian rolled his eyes skywards. He was finished, and he knew it.
Well, Julius, me old fruit,
Rimmer grinned.
Looks like you're a goner.
Caesar took off his laurel wreath and scratched his balding head.
I'm going to get a drink,
he stormed, and stalked off to the poolside bar.
So,
Rimmer turned to his 2 remaining adversaries.
Just Messrs. Patton and Bonaparte left in.
God damn you, you dirty son of a bitch.
General Patton threw his huge cigar into the pool.
Throw the dice and get it over with.
One of the waiters, Rimmer couldn't remember his name, leaned over and whispered discreetly.
There's a gentleman in the main reception who insists on seeing you, sir.
Send him away.
He insists, sir.
Send him away, I'm busy.
He says his name is Lister, sir. Claims he was your cohort on the Red Dwarf.
Lister stood in the mahogany-panelled library, where the man in the penguin suit had finally ushered him. He helped himself to a foot-long Havana cigar and sat in the huge leather reading chair, his legs crossed on the polished walnut table. The 12-feet-high double doors swung open, and Rimmer strode in, grinning.
Listy! Long time no see. I was going to invite you, but, I didn't really think it was your scene.
You've done pretty well for yourself. What are you now, the 2nd richest man in the world?
3rd,
said Rimmer modestly.
Long way to go before I'm 2nd.
And married to Juanita Chicata?
I'm getting by,
Rimmer nodded. He reached into the drawer behind his desk.
So, 2 years. Has it really been 2 years?
Yup.
I've missed you. First 6 months of my marriage, I couldn't get to sleep, because for some unfathomable reason, Juanita doesn't snore like an adenoidal pig.
Lister lassoed Rimmer with a huge grey smoke ring, and grinned back.
So,
said Rimmer, taking out a cheque-book a yard long, with more pages than a James Clavell novel.
You finally came to see me. How much do you want? 1, 2, 3, 4 pounds?
Rimmer threw back his head and brayed loudly. You're a smeghead, Rimmer. You really are a smeghead.
But a rich smeghead, eh?
Rimmer brayed again.
Oh, seriously, what do you want?
He poised his pen over the cheque.
A couple of mil? What do you want?
I want, Lister said, leaning forward, to go back to Earth.
Come again?
This isn't Earth. Rimmer smiled uncomprehendingly. I'm afraid, Arn, Lister continued, we've taken the wrong turning. We're in another plane of reality. Somehow we've wound up playing better than life. We're just a couple of game heads. It couldn't be. It was... well, it just couldn't be. Rimmer followed Lister down the narrow white stone steps to the roof garden, where the party was still in full swing. Lister was jealous, plain and simple. Rimmer didn't like to say it to his face, because it would be like rubbing it in. But it was only natural he should feel jealous. Rimmer had everything. He'd amassed a $50 billion fortune, whereas Lister had amassed a leaky house, a silly car, and a wife and 2 kids. The poor boy had flipped. He couldn't accept he was a failure, and Rimmer was a hit. So he was trying to persuade everybody they were in the wrong dimension of reality. Totally flipperoonied. Heard from the cat? Lister was asking.
No, he's on some island off Denmark. Haven't heard from him since we got back to Earth. You?
Lister shook his head, grabbed a bottle of Dom Perignon from a passing ice bucket, and they sat down. He rolled back his sleeves. Let me show you me arms.
Your arms?
Both me arms look perfectly normal, don't they? Rimmer looked at his perfectly normal arms and nodded. Rimmer started looking round for his bodyguards. But they hurt like hell. And when I put ointment over the spots that hurt, it spells out a message. Rimmer shook his head, smiling.
Amazing.
Watch. Lister took a jar of cold cream out of his jacket pocket and daubed dying on his left arm, and U equals BTL on his right.
Now, I don't want to sound like I'm a skeptic.
Rimmer rubbed the flat of his hand against his face.
But you have to concede that the effect I've just witnessed could just as easily be produced by an insane person with 2 arms and a pot of cold cream.
Yes, but I'm just covering the areas of pain. It's the pain that spells out the message.
The pain?
In me arms. Someone's trying to get a message to us.
On your arms through the cold cream?
Look, if we are in the game, we won't know we're in the game. It protects itself. It won't let you remember that you've started to play it.
But we didn't start to play it.
No, we don't remember starting to play it. That's different. Rimmer flopped back in his seat and looked round the roof garden. He looked at the 2,000 people dancing a conga round the pool. He looked at the phalanx of waiters holding the silver platters above their heads, serving the second course of the banquet. He looked across at the sous chef atop a ladder, carving generous portions of meat from the barbecued giraffe which slowly rotated on the 40-foot spit. Could this really not be real? If we're in the game, Lister continued, we're wandering around somewhere with electrodes in our brains, totally oblivious to the real world. Someone in that real world is trying to tell us where we are by burning or cutting or scratching a message into my arms. U equals BTL. You are in better than life. And dying. In reality, I'm dying. I'm a gamehead.
But it doesn't make sense. I thought when you're in the game, all your fantasies were supposed to come true. But look at you, stuck in some hick town in the back end of nowhere with a wife and 2 kids and no money.
Money isn't important to me, Rimmer snorted. Bedford Falls and everything else. Lister shook his head wistfully. That was everything I always wanted. There was a series of explosions, and 40,000 fireworks burst in the night sky, forming a portrait of Rimmer and Juanita in a pink Valentine's heart. While the awestruck guests gazed in open-mouthed wonder, the fireworks portrait animated. Rimmer's face winked down at them, then turned and kissed Juanita's image. Then 2 huge bangs, and the 2 faces transformed into the Rimmer Corporation company logo. The standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. Come on, Rimmer. Face facts. Look at this place. The Rimmer Building, overlooking the Champs-Élysées. Your company inventing the sologram. You're married to the most famous actress in the world. Is any of it even remotely credible? Lister stood up and pointed across the pool, his voice raised an octave in incredulity. Who the hell are they? Rimmer looked round. Lister was waving his arms excitedly.
The guys under the parasol, applauding. Napoleon Bonaparte, Julius Caesar, and General Patton. And what are they doing here? Oh, that. There's a perfectly rational explanation for that.
Rimmer nodded vigorously. Lister grabbed another bottle of champagne.
Which is?
It's a bit hush-hush at the moment. I'm not really at liberty to say.
Unhush-hush it?
Rimmer mulled it over. Well, it would be public knowledge in a week or so. Couldn't do any harm. He leaned over conspiratorially. Rimmer Corporation Worldwide, plc, have developed a time machine. I've been playing around with it for a few months, inviting famous people from different eras in time to pep up a few dinner parties. Lister was looking at him in a strange way.
What's wrong with that?
Rimmer protested.
You don't think that's believable? No, I don't. I think you just wanted to meet these people, so your imagination had to cook up a nearly credible explanation to bring them here. Nonsense,
said Rimmer, but without conviction. Could it be true? Could he have fantasized the invention of a time machine, just so he could bring back Caesar, Bonaparte, and Patton, the three greatest generals in history, simply in order to beat them at Risk, the strategic war game for ages 15 and over? Could he really be that small-minded?
Come on.
Lister stood up and drained the bottle. We've got to find the cat. Rimmer picked up a phone and punched in 3 numbers.
Harry, put the Learjet on standby. Mr. Rimmer and guest will be going to Denmark this evening.
He put the phone down and turned to Lister.
Wait in the car. I'd better say goodbye to,
And he wandered off.
In the middle of our party? You are going off with your stupid friend to Denmark?
Juanita, still naked from the waist down apart from the diamond stilettos, stormed up and down the parquet floor of the roof garden's white balustraded gazebo. Rimmer thrust his hands deep in his pockets and squirmed.
Darling, I know it's awful, but the thing is, there's an outside chance.
Rimmer didn't know quite how to put this.
There's a tiny little possibility that you don't exist. I don't what? It's only a slight chance, and there's probably nothing to worry about. But if Lister's right, you're just a figment of my imagination. And for this reason, you are leaving my party and flying to Denmark? Yes, said Rimmer. It's a sort of metaphysical emergency. This man comes here this evening with his stupid furry hat and tells you your wife doesn't exist, and you go waltzing off with him to Scandinavia?
You're right. I won't go. Of course you exist. I'll go down to the car and explain that we've talked it through and we've come to the conclusion that we all do exist and we don't want anything more to do with him.
You're crazy! My mother was right. She always warned me against marrying a dead man.
Rimmer watched her naked, tanned bottom as she clomped down the summer-house steps and wandered over to a group of people eating their barbecued giraffe steaks. He scanned the group. Lenin, Einstein, Archimedes, God, and Norman Wisdom. Wisdom was staggering around, laughing hysterically with his jacket half off his shoulders. Suddenly, without warning, he threw himself up into the air and landed on the floor. Lenin, Einstein, and Archimedes looked down rather disdainfully. God splurted out his mouthful of Cinzano Bianco and bellowed uncontrollably, tears streaming down his face.
Ugh, that's comedy, God was saying. That is comedy.
Let's face it, Rimmer thought. There was at least a marginal possibility that Lister was right. The black stretch Mercedes, with a tinted bulletproof glass, purred onto the shiny black tar-macadammed runway of Rimmer International Airport, AJR, and drew up alongside the black Learjet, Rimmer 1. The 20-minute journey had been conducted mainly in silence. Lister had been watching MTV on one of the car's TV sets, where a poll had proclaimed Rimmer as the sexiest man of all time. Second was Clark Gable, and third was Hugo Lovepole. Rimmer had smiled wanly. It was turning into a nightmare. If this was indeed his fantasy, and he was still clinging on to a faint hope that Lister was wrong, but if it was his fantasy, It was suddenly hideously embarrassing. His psyche, lain bare for all to see. The chauffeur clicked round the car and opened one of the 8 passenger doors, and they got out. Lister looked at the chauffeur and almost said hello, because at first he thought he knew him. Then he realized he didn't, but he'd seen his face somewhere.
Who's the driver?
He whispered to Rimmer as they walked across to the Learjet steps.
It's a lovely evening, isn't it?
Is he somebody famous? Lister persisted.
Who?
The driver.
No.
Who is he then? Rimmer started to climb the steps.
He's my dad,
he said quietly.
I brought him back in the time machine.
To be your chauffeur? Lister wrinkled his cheeks in disbelief.
Yes,
Rimmer hissed.
I'm very proud of you, son,
his father called.
I'm so proud, I'm fit to burst.
Shut up, said Rimmer. As they got to the top of the Learjet steps, the screaming started. Rimmer had been dreading it. He'd hoped they might be able to slip aboard unnoticed, but even this small mercy was denied him. As Lister turned, hanging over the observation balcony of the airport terminal building, 20,000 teenage girls caught in the helpless throes of Rimmermania waved intimate garments and banners, screamed and chanted uncontrollably.
Arnold, we love you! Arnie!
Rimmer shook his head in humiliation, his cheeks glowing baboon bottom red. They screamed as he half nodded at them. Lister squinted, trying to read the banners. Arnie is brave, he could make out. Arnie has had lots of girlfriends. Arnie is fab. He turned to Rimmer. Basically, he grinned. You just want to be adored, don't you?
Thank you, Sigmund,
said Rimmer without parting his teeth.
It's really quite cute. Look, we're still not 100% sure that this is a fantasy. And if it turns out it's not, you're going to feel plenty silly as you drive your clapped-out old banger back to Nowhere City.
Rimmer ducked his head and disappeared into the body of the plane. Rimmer wasn't really watching the in-flight movie, but he was wearing the headset as a kind of sanctuary to avoid Lister's accusing grin. The film was Darkness at Noon, which had culled Juanita her first Oscar. How Rimmer remembered that evening, the 25-minute thank you speech she'd made, saying it was all down to him. He watched her play the scene in the apartment, the famous olives on the cocktail stick scene. Could he really have fantasized this woman? It was absurd. Why would he fantasize a woman, no matter how beautiful, who was trouble with a capital T the size of the GPO tower? Because he wanted the most exciting woman in the world, the most desired, the most beautiful, the most dangerous. But having got her, why would he then fantasize she was unfaithful? With Hugo, the hairy-shouldered pool attendant, what the hell did that say about the state of his mind? Mentally unwell, that's what it said. And why had he fantasized his wife's refusal to make love with him for the past 18 months? Why on earth did he want that to happen? Was it that, even in his fantasies, Rimmer couldn't bring himself to believe anyone could truly love him? That, inevitably, she would reject him, giving him those pathetic excuses that the insurance company wouldn't allow him to touch her bosoms, and inevitably she would take a lover who was more masculine than him, more manly? Oh, my God. My God, my God, my God. He moaned softly. The innards of his psyche were there for all to see, putrid and rotten and rancid, his neuroses parading like contestants in the Mr. Universe contest. He glanced over at Lister, who had taken out a well-worn leather wallet and was looking sadly at some dog-eared photographs of his family back in Bedford Falls. Hadn't Lister's fantasy been even more ridiculous? A leaky house, a clapped-out car, a little shop. It was so corny. A girl-next-door type wife, 2 kids. If they were playing better than life, He could have had anything he wanted. Absolutely anything he wanted. And this was his choice? Something so ordinary, so small, so normal? Oh, my God, my God, my God. That was the truth, wasn't it? Lister's fantasy was so much more mature than his. Lister didn't need mega wealth to make him happy. He needed $14.25. He didn't need a stunning-looking actress desired by all. He just wanted someone who cared for him. Even the car. Rimmer had a 25-foot black penis extension. Lister had a clapped-out old banger. What did that mean, then? That Lister had a limousine inside his Y-fronts, while Rimmer had a 1940s Ford that needed hand-cranking? Lister's was the fantasy of a man at peace with himself, a man who felt he had nothing to prove. Rimmer's, 25-foot cars, 140-story buildings, airports, Learjets, $20 million bosoms, $40 billion fortunes, his father as his own chauffeur. It couldn't be a fantasy. No one could be that screwed up. Lister sat there looking at the black and white dog-eared snaps, which Mr. Colquhoun, the photographer, had taken last Christmas Eve with his old box brownie on its tripod, with the magnesium flare. There was one in particular of him and Kochanski with big cheesy grins. So, you don't exist, he thought. I just made you exist and fall in love with me. He was still hung up on Christine Kochanski, a girl he dated for 5 weeks and 2 days 3 million years ago. In a way, he was kind of jealous of Rimmer. If he'd have known it was a fantasy, he'd have become Jim Bexley Speed and dated Ida Lupino. He'd have played with the Beatles, the Fab Five, John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Dave. But he hadn't. He'd settled down in Bedford Falls and married Christine Kochanski. He'd wanted to live his life in a movie. What a jerk. What an even bigger jerk for falling in love with someone who, if she'd been alive and real and with him now, probably would give him a sweet smile and sit down at the back of the plane with one of her wacky mates. Sure, they'd had a great 2 years, but it hadn't been real, none of it. Counterfeit delights. A pathetic hankering on account of a crazy obsession. Unreal. Impossible. Ridiculous. The air hostess leaned over him. "Can I get you anything?" She smiled. It was Ida Lupino. Ida Lupino was standing in the aisle dressed as an air hostess. "Anything at all?" She twinkled. Lister shook his head. I'm married to someone who doesn't exist with 2 non-existent kids. I can't get involved with someone else who doesn't exist. Life would get too complicated." The Lear landed in Copenhagen. The Danish government laid on a powerboat to get them across to the Cat's Island. They sat in the back of the boat as it cut through the billowing waves of the foul-tempered sea. The island loomed through circles of mist, towering above the stormy waters, a single sea-ringed mountain tapering into the clouds. As they moved slowly closer, something at the very summit caught the sunlight and glimmered. They moored the boat at a crumbling wooden jetty and looked around, trying to find a route up the unclimbable mountain. They heard a sound, a creaking steel chain, and crashing out of the soggy mist, a cable car lurched to a halt in front of them. They sat rocking in the dangerous wind as the cable car slowly squeaked its way up the mountain. The trip took 3 hours. They went through cloud. The atmospheric pressure changed. Whatever the cat's fantasy was, it certainly didn't involve entertaining a great many visitors. Finally, the cable car wheezed into its mooring, and they got out. Standing on a narrow mountain track were 2 rickshaws, attended by 8-foot-tall, huge-breasted Amazon Valkyries in scanty armor. Lister shook his head. "I've really got to have a word with the cat about his sexual politics." Worse was to follow, because as Lister climbed aboard the rickshaw, he realized that the 2 wing mirrors he'd assumed were for the giantesses to see behind them were in fact strategically placed so the passenger could spend the short trip to the mountain top watching their cartoon-sized boobs jiggling up the track. He shook his head again.
Who did he get this place from? Benny Hill?
He climbed out.
Forget it. We'll walk.
Rimmer tried to hide his disappointment as they trudged up the curving track. As they reached the crest, they saw it. Any faint hopes that Rimmer still entertained, that they were on Earth and in the world of reality, gurgled noisily down the plug hole as they gazed up at the cat's home. It was a 30-towered golden castle surrounded by a moat filled with milk. The tip of the highest golden tower was almost invisible to the naked eye. The battlements were patrolled by more of the horn-helmeted, skimpily armoured Valkyries. Lister and Rimmer clumped noisily across the wooden drawbridge.
Halt! Who goes there, buddy?
One of the Valkyries shouted from the gatehouse.
We've come to see the cat,
shouted Lister, his voice sounding weak and ineffectual by comparison. They were led into the castle and through a maze of chambers. The cat's portrait hung on every wall. Here clad in gleaming armour, there grinning from a rearing horse, there wrestling a lion, here draped on top of a pink piano. They followed the guards out into an ornamental garden that made the grounds of the Palace of Versailles look like a window box. Rimmer began to regret the smallness of his own imagination. The guards were marching double time, and Lister and Rimmer felt compelled to keep up. They were getting quite tired by the time they reached the end of the gardens, which let out onto a courtyard surrounded by stables. The cat, in a red riding jacket, gleaming white joppers, and black leather boots, was mounted on a cream-coloured, fire-breathing racing yak. There was a smell of sulphur hanging in the air as the yak reared and tried to bolt. The cat deftly wrestled it under control, laughing as it haughtily spouted 2 more jets of fire from its nostrils. A dozen hunting dogs yapped and bayed and snapped at the leashes held by 4 Valkyries. As the dragon yak ceased its protestations, the cat turned and caught sight of Rimmer and Lister.
Hey, what's happening?
He waved his black riding cap and tooted his hunting horn, driving the dogs berserk.
Sydney,
He called to the tallest of the Valkyries.
Saddle, Dancer, and Prancer. Guys,
He turned to Rimmer and Lister.
grab a yak.
Rimmer mounted his flame-coloured yak with more than a little trepidation, and held timidly onto the reins.
I've never really ridden a fire-breathing racing yak before,
He said unnecessarily. Lister patted the neck of his beast and used the resultant jet of flame to light one of the foot-long Havana cigars he'd stolen from Rimmer's study back in Paris. Then he hooked a foot into the stirrup and clambered into the saddle. The cat tooted his curved hunting horn and called to the Valkyries restraining the hounds.
Release the dogs!
The dozen hunting dogs screamed out of the courtyard. The cat reared on his yak and bellowed,
Tally-ho!
and all 3 of them thundered over the cobblestones and out into the dank, misty wasteland that surrounded the castle. Lister clung desperately to the neck of the bouncing yak, the reins hanging free as it splashed through the bogland which was covered in a carpet of mist. Before him, whenever he dared to open his eyes, he could see the cat, straight-backed, holding onto the reins with his left hand, a silver shooting pistol in his right, while behind him he could hear the occasional low moans of Rimmer as he recited various incantations from a number of different religions. They came to a low hedge. The dogs burst through it, and the yaks leapt over. As they hammered across the hard, frosty ground, Lister saw the cat level his pistol. He couldn't see the quarry, and he wasn't particularly keen to. They were riding fire-breathing dragon yaks. What on earth could they be hunting? He saw the cat's shoulder jerk back, and a puff of smoke, before he heard the crack of the pistol. In the distance, one of the dogs cartwheeled 12 feet into the air and landed dead on the floor.
No!
Lister yelled, as the cat quickly picked off the 11 remaining dogs. He reined in the yak, raised his horn, and tooted a victory call. "You shot all the smeggin' dogs," said Lister, gulping for air.
They're vermin,
Laughed the cat.
what did you think we were shooting?
He raised himself in his saddle and called to the entourage of Valkyries galloping up on horses some way behind them.
More dogs, Sidney.
They stood before the roaring fire in the vast inglenook fireplace of the cat's baronial dining hall, drinking hot milk laced with cinnamon from pewter mugs. The cat stood, resting a spat-covered foot on the gold fender, his elbow crooked above his head on the marble mantelpiece, shaking his head, staring into the fire.
You mean none of this is real? None of this actually exists? Of course it doesn't,
Rimmer snorted in disgust.
Fire-breathing yaks? 8-foot-tall Nordic goddesses? A castle surrounded by a moat of milk? Is any of it even remotely tinged with credibility? I don't understand how you could ever believe it was.
Lister thought of the Rimmer buildings, Paris, New York, and London, but he didn't say anything.
I mean,
Rimmer shook his head.
at least our fantasies were possible. Perhaps not likely, but possible. But yours is just totally preposterous. It's like a gothic fairy tale. How come you didn't suspect anything? Didn't you think it was a little bit odd the way you just acquired all this? No, I just thought I deserved it.
Deserved it? Lister tilted his head.
Because I'm so good looking.
A naked, oiled Valkyrie banged the enormous gong and announced it was supper. As they took their places at the long oak banquet table, the lights dimmed, and a spotlight picked out Sidney holding a large silver platter at the top of a stone staircase which led up to the balcony skirting the baronial hall. The flagstones in the middle of the hall slid apart, and from beneath a 7-piece band rose up on a hydraulic pedestal. Mozart on piano, Jimi Hendrix on lead guitar, Stefan Grappelli on rhythm, Charlie Parker on sax, Yehudi Menwin on violin, Buddy Rich on drums, and Jelly Bean on computer programs. They began to play.
Listen to these boys.
The cat confided.
They really kick ass.
They had never heard the tune before, but it was so perfect, so instantly classic. Lister and Rimmer immediately started tapping along with the heavenly beat. Sidney danced down the stairs, flanked by 40 lurex-clad Valkyries, all bearing platters and singing, "He's gonna eat your little fishes, he's gonna eat your little fish, he's gonna eat your little fishes, 'cause he likes eating fish." 3 platters were placed before them, each containing a large aquarium, packed with writhing shoals of vividly coloured fish. Rimmer eyed his dinner with disgust.
Don't you prefer them caught and cooked? No, sir,
said the cat, picking up the mini fishing rod which was laid out with the cutlery by his plate.
I like my food to move. I think,
said Rimmer, draping his napkin over the fish tank,
we've established beyond all reasonable doubt that we are playing better than life.
Right, Lister agreed. But the question is, how do we get out?
Why do we have to get out?
Asked the cat as he sucked a squirming angelfish off the hook of his rod. Because it's a computer-induced fantasy. Because it's not real. And in the real world, our bodies are wasting away. We're dying.
What are you talking about?
Lister explained about the messages on his arms, and how it meant that someone was trying to get through to them.
Which someone?
Asked the cat.
Holly, obviously,
said Rimmer. Lister shook his head. Maybe. We don't know. We don't know exactly at what point we started playing the game. How much of this has been real? Did we get back to Earth? Did we fix the Nova 5? Did the Nova 5 exist? Maybe I started playing BTL back on Mimas, and you two don't exist. Maybe our whole relationship and everything that's happened has been part of my fantasy.
No, I exist,
said Rimmer.
Honestly.
Yeah, but you'd say that even if you didn't exist, said Lister.
He's right,
said the cat.
maybe I don't exist either. That would certainly explain why I'm so unbearably good-looking. Oh, I don't believe this,
said Rimmer.
Not only am I dead, I don't exist either. Thanks a lot, God.
No, look. I think we have to assume. Lister punctuated assume with a circled thumb and forefinger. That we all exist, and that we got into the game before the Nova 5 left Red Dwarf.
Okay,
said Rimmer.
How do we get out?
I think I can answer that,
said a fourth voice. A familiar figure waddled through the stone archway and up to the banquet table, and he started to explain everything. Rimmer lurched happily down Corridor 4, Gamma 311.
It's a funny thing.
He slurred.
Even though I've had so much to drink, I'm in total confac of my Mondelties.
Where is he?
said Lister, poking his head into another of the sleeping quarters on the habitation deck.
Where the smeg's the cat?
Master Holly says he's on this deck,
said Crichton, peering through the hatchway of another empty sleeping quarters.
Then why the hell doesn't he answer?
said Lister, tugging the ring pull on another bottle of self-heating sake. Rimmer's duplicate had been erased that morning, just before the gazpacho soup confession. The Nova 5 was reconstructed, fueled, and ready to go. They would be back at Earth in 3 months, and they'd spent the day celebrating down in the Copacabana Hawaiian cocktail bar. The evening had gurgled by in a blurry haze of ever more elaborate cocktails, before either of them had realized the cat had been missing for 2 days. Lister had led the drunken safari up to the habitation deck to find him. There were over 3,000 separate sleeping quarters on this deck alone, and they had looked through more than half of them before they staggered into Petrovich's old room. The 2 lockers had been pulled away from the wall, and in a crudely chiseled recess in the wall was a stack of game headbands. Petrovich, the high-flying, career-minded leader of A-Shift, had been smuggling Better Than Life, the illegal hallucinogenic brain implant. He'd been smuggling it to the richly paid, insanely bored terraforming engineers of Triton. The rumors were true. This correct officer, this model, this paragon, was a low-life scumbag game dealer. At a glance, Lister estimated there must have been 100 headbands. Petrovich could safely have expected to make 10 years' wages if he found 100 suckers who were prepared to buy the cripplingly addictive nirvana offered by the deadly game. And there always were suckers, plenty of them. Not one person ever entered the game without believing they could take it or leave it. Once inside, few ever made the painful journey back to reality. The cat gently rocked on the sleeping quarters armchair, giggling insanely. The silver headband glimmered menacingly on his head, the electrodes buried deep inside his brain. His face was painted with the harrowingly familiar vacant grin of the lost soul of a gamehead. The 3 of them sat around the banquet table in the baronial hall of a cat's fantasy, as Crichton recounted how Lister had followed the cat into the game.
But Better Than Life's addictive? I knew that.
You were drunk, Mr. David. You thought you'd be okay just to go into the game and tell the cat what danger he was in. But once you'd linked up to the cat's headband, you didn't come out.
What about me?
said Rimmer.
Why did I go in?
You were drunk too. You said you had the willpower to drag them both out. You got Holly to splice you into the game, and that was the last we saw of you.
Crichton told how they had wandered around Red Dwarf in the twilight zombie state the game induced. How he'd done his best to feed them, and keep them from harming themselves. But over the months, the cat's and Lister's bodies had begun to wither. Sometimes they'd spend weeks in a single position and develop huge bedsores. They'd tumble downstairs and get up bloody and laughing, believing they'd made a parachute jump or some such thing. How he'd once seen Lister eat his own vomit with delight, obviously believing he was enjoying some sumptuous delicacy. How in desperation he'd begun lasering the messages into Lister's arms to warn him of the danger. This had distressed Crichton greatly. It was built into his software that he mustn't harm human beings. Months of cajoling by Holly had finally persuaded him that not to do it would hurt Lister even more. But still, the three of them remained in the game. In the end, Crichton had no choice but to enter himself.
"But that's stupid," said Lister. "You'll get addicted too."
Crichton shook his head.
Holly was right. I'm immune. I could have come in right at the start and rescued you."
"Immune?"
said Rimmer.
"Why are you immune?"
Crichton cracked his face into a hollow grin.
I'm a mechanoid. I don't have dreams. I don't have fantasies the way you do. I have very few expectations or desires."
"Very few,"
said Lister.
"Then you do have some."
A Valkyrie appeared, bearing a brand-new, freshly wrapped squeezy mop.
"Only one,"
said Crichton, accepting the gift and tearing off the paper.
"Oh, wonderful! A squeezy mop. Just what I've always wanted."
"Okay," said Lister, leaning forward. "The $64 million pound question? How do we get out?" The windscreen wipers patted the snow into neat white triangles on the Model A's window as the car grunted past the white-coated sign, Bedford Falls, 2 miles. Lister banged at the dashboard with a gloved hand, and the faltering heater whirred back from the dead and unenthusiastically started to demist the windscreen. Lister craned over the steering column and tried to make out the grey ruts in the snow which served as a rough indication as to where the road might be. He was leaving the game. It was easy to leave the game, easier than he'd have thought. First, you had to want to leave, and of course, to want to leave, you had to know you were in the game in the first place. That was the hard part, realizing that this wasn't reality. Then, it was only a matter of finding an exit. Just that. A door marked Exit.
"And where are these doors?"
he'd asked Crichton.
"It's your fantasy,"
Crichton had replied.
"They're wherever you want them to be."
"Simple as that?"
"Simple as that."
So there it was. All he had to do was imagine an exit and go through it. He'd pass through an exit and find himself back on Red Dwarf, probably thin and gaunt and wasted from his 2 years in the game, but nevertheless back in reality. Once back, he could remove his headband, no, destroy his headband, destroy them all, then start the long haul back to health. But it was an individual matter. They all had to create their own separate exits, alone. You're born alone, you die alone, you leave the game alone. The glimmering lights of Bedford Falls twinkled in the valley below, as for the last time he made his way down the hill to his personal Shangri-La. Ever since he'd left Earth, every step he'd taken had led him further away from the dirty, polluted world he loved. First Mimas, then the outer reaches of the solar system, then deep space, and finally here, in the wrong dimension of the wrong plane of reality. It was hard to imagine how he could ever be further away from home. The Ford juddered down the main street and under the strings of lights that hung from trees down the avenue. He passed Horace's bank, and through the window saw the money still stacked in neat piles on the counter. He passed Old Man Gower's drugstore. How could he have believed it existed? He passed Martini's bar, alive inside with joyful revelers celebrating Christmas Eve. He headed the old car down Sycamore Avenue and slid to rest outside 220. There, In the middle of the street, a pink neon sign hung over a shimmering archway. There was his exit, just as he'd imagined it. On the other side was reality. It started to snow. Christmas Eve. How could he leave them on Christmas Eve? What harm was one more day? He turned away from the dissolving exit and crunched up the drive to 220. One more night of that pinball smile. Just one. He couldn't leave them on Christmas Eve. But of course, in Bedford Falls, it was always Christmas Eve.